And I thought what I could do is just open up for a little bit with some framing about who St. Francis was, and what his life was, and a little bit about his story. And I think it's important to do that just because, we probably all live in, I am going out on a limb to say we might all live somewhere where there's a shelter or a community center or, anything that is named after St. Francis. And even the Pope St. Francis, obviously his papal name is taken after St. Francis of Assisi. And so he's a big part of our culture. He's a big part of kind of just the everyday lives of a lot of folks. And I can speak for myself when I say he means a lot to me. I can share a little bit about, take this with a grain of salt because I'm an incredibly superstitious person. I see signs and everything. I see people talking to me from all different things and everything, but I do really feel like I have a very strong connection with St. Francis. And it really was solidified a few years back when I was living at my first apartment in Atlanta. And I was going through a particularly pretty hard time in my life. And one day when I was cleaning out my apartment, I opened this drawer and this medal of St. Francis fell out. I don't know where it came from. I didn't buy it and no one got it for me. But I was like, okay, well, I don't know who this guy is that well, but I'm going through a hard time. I need all the help I can get. And so I started wearing that medal all the time. And then after that, I kept seeing him all around me. He kept popping out at, whatever I was doing. I would see photos of him, statues of him, stuff like that. And the moment that really tipped it over, when I was like, I really need to learn who this guy is, was I was taking out my trash one day and I realized that my landlord had a statue of St. Francis next to the trash can. And I was like, that's a little much. I was like, there's like definitely something going on here. And so that night I went back into my apartment and I watched this documentary that was about the life of St. Francis. And it genuinely really transformed me. And his story and his life was so moving to me. St. Francis was the son of a very wealthy merchant in Italy. He spent much of his childhood, and youth partying and, having a good time. And he was kind of known as like the life of the party around the block. And when he was in his like young adulthood, his town ended up going to war. And so Francis ended up serving in the military, and at that time was taken captive as a prisoner of war. When he was a prisoner of war and when he was in captivity and near death, he had a real spiritual, like moving experience where he felt God calling to him in some way, but he didn't really know what to do with that. And so he went back home after the war ended and he just kind of felt aimless. And people kept inviting him to parties, people kept inviting him to come out, but he just really wasn't feeling it anymore. But he really didn't know what exactly he was supposed to be doing. And then one day he went and he was walking out in the outskirts of his town and he came across this really old beat up church. And so he went into this old beat up church. And while he was in this church, all this rafters and stuff like that are all falling down inside this church. He hears the voice of God. And the voice of God says to him, "Francis, repair my church." And he's a very literal person. So in that moment, he thinks what God is asking him to do is literally fix up the church that he was in. And so he starts, taking tools and fixing up the church on the inside. But the more and more he works on this, the more that he realizes that God is asking for something greater. He's asking for God to transform his whole church. And so he goes back home and he decides that he's going to live in the life of God. And you have to understand the Catholic Church at this time, church always took place inside, of a church place. It was very, at this time, it was a lot of stuff that had to do with like Saint Benedictine kind of theology. So stuff that was a lot about like prayer and contemplation and, being obedient to God. And that was kind of like the crux of, what really the church was about at that moment. But Francis felt that maybe what it actually meant to be a part of this church was to be out in the community and helping people. And so he decided to take he decided to leave and start his own brotherhood, and basically commit himself to a life of poverty and to obedience to God. And when he told his dad that, there's this very famous story where he goes and tells his dad that he's leaving town and he's going to join the church, and his dad is like, dude, you're wearing my clothes, you're in my like my town, how dare you say this to me, how dare you give it up? And Francis is like, okay, fine, then I won't wear your clothes. And so he takes off his clothes, and then he goes out in the town. He's just like stark naked in the town, and he just like leaves, and he's going to like follow a life of God. And what he finds when he does that is he's constantly just listening to what God is asking him to do. And so one day, he's walking past a leper, and at first he feels disgusted and by this leper and disgusted by him. But then he hears the voice of God tell him that it's his duty as a Catholic person and as a Christian person to care for that person and to love that person as his brother. And so he goes out and he hugs the leper, and his ministry to the leper becomes a really, really core part of what he does. And so gradually, as Francis is out in the community caring for folks and being obedient to God by and carrying that out in the way of loving the folks around him, people start to join him, and his brotherhood becomes bigger and bigger. His order becomes bigger. But the Catholic Church isn't happy about that, because, for them at the time, what was important to them was that you were just worshiping inside a church, that you were listening to a priest, and that you were just trying to be obedient to the way of God. And Francis was going against that. And so for years and years, they actually called Francis a heretic. They said that what he was doing was against what God was asking us. And eventually his order got too big and his influence got too big, and the Catholic Church had to accept him as an official order within the Catholic Church. And Francis also went on to help found the Poor Sisters with St. Clare. He truly believed that women also had a strong and powerful place within the church, and so he helped St. Clara also found her order as well, which is the companion to the Brotherhood. There's a lot I could say about St. Francis and a lot that I'm leaving out about his story. But I know for me personally, one of the things that was most significant about St. Francis is by the time of the end of his life, St. Francis ended up actually starting to be pushed out of his own order. His order, now kind of under the influence of the church, started to turn to things and value things such as, kind of being a, good, biblical study and stuff like that, and kind of take away people's focus from being a little bit more of a street ministry to something that was a little bit more academic. And so they kind of started pushing Francis out by the end of his life. And then at the very end of his life, Francis, his obedience to God never wavered, and his commitment to his order never wavered. But he did, at the end of his life, end up dying alone. And so many folks know St. Francis as the patron saint of, caring for the poor or for, loving animals. But what folks don't often know is that St. Francis is also the patron saint of dying alone. And that for me was one of the most significant things that drew me so closely to him, was someone who so strongly felt the word of God and God speaking to him and God asking him to do, his will, and him constantly carrying that out, no matter the cost, and no matter, if it cost him popularity, if it cost him his order. He would never waver from what he knew was true of what God was asking, not just of him, but of all of us, which is to constantly work to be repairing the church, and to constantly work to being in our society and walking with folks and caring for folks constantly and endlessly. And so I feel really grateful that we're taking some time today to honor St. Francis, because I think for all his power and all his beauty, I think he's also one of the most misunderstood saints. He's also one of the saints that is used the most to uphold band-aid solutions of charity or of stuff like that, when in fact I believe that St. Francis comes from a beautiful and a radical call from God to constantly be transforming our church and constantly be transforming our society.